The Irish travel magazine of 1928 exhorts its angling tourists about
the upper Liffey between Ballyward Bridge and Capure is broken into many fine pools that harbour a fair stock of trout.
The higher waters of the Liffey flow through peat bog and over granite, and they have a very acid reaction, and in acid situation nothing grows very well. Lots of insects, but they're all very small. Lots of trout, but they only have small insects to eat, so the trout are very small. My grandfather used to cycle out from Rathgar and fish for them, but they were very small trout. But downstream in the main Liffey, the trout were bigger, and this is where the fabulous trout developed.
The Liffey near Blessington had a reputation for good fishing for trout, as newspapers were reporting for over half a century before, quoting sizes of 3 and 4 pounds. That gave the basis of a tourist business that the young Irish state needed to develop. The River Liffey at Blessington was just that then, a river, running up to a steep waterfall at Pulafuka.
A normal healthy Irish river would have salmon and eel. Because of the high waterfall at Pulafuka, neither salmon nor eel were ever able to get to this part of it. So the only fish were brown trout and stickleback. One time I thought that this was the sort of original state of things, and then I thought, well, how did the trout get here? So in fact, it's very likely that the trout were brought in by some enthusiastic fishing people. Goodness knows when, but there's no record of that happening.
The building of the dam in 1939 and the resulting flooding of the valley gave rise to a new, incredibly good trout fishery, as the trout enjoyed the lake all to themselves, a nice spin-off from a controversial project and a boost for tourism.
When fishing yarns come true,
the Irish Independent declared in 1943.
Heavy catches of brown trout, many of them plump 5 and 6 pounders, have been the happy lot of the Dublin angler this season.
Even Jack Kennedy's father, then US ambassador to the UK, is reputed to have travelled to fish during the war in the new lake. Such was its reputation.
And then, not many years afterward, the whole trout population collapsed because they were infected by a parasite that they had not been exposed to before.
Alarm bells were sounded in a cash-strapped Irish government keen to find out what was going on in their potential tourist fishery. A young scientist called Christopher Moriarty was pictured in the Examiner leading the lonely scientific search for the answers in the lake.
It was my first job after graduating, and I did that for a couple of years. Trout, they survived the parasite. They did get over it in the end. But then nobody knows who introduced perch. And the perch competed with the trout and very much outdid them. And so the lake effectively was no longer a particularly good trout fishery, which was the main finding of my study, that they were eating the same thing, only the perch were proliferating and they were outnumbering the trout by at least 10 to 1, so the trout hadn't a hope. And so the lake lost its value as a trout fishery.
Another unwelcome visitor introduced to the lake was pike. First observed around 1960, pike thrived in the lake and are still plentiful today, giving rise to pike fishing competitions due to their numbers and size.
The feeling amongst some of the trout anglers at the time was that if there are no pike, the trout will feed on the bottom, therefore they won't rise for flies. If you introduce pike, the pike will make the trout stop feeding on the bottom and the trout will rise for flies. They didn't reckon with the fact that pike eat trout. So we then had the introduction of roach, and now it's a good fishery for pike and for roach, but not much. Not many anglers fish for perch, which again is very interesting. I know in Switzerland and quite a few other countries, perch is very, very highly prized food fish, and it's sort of despised. It's a long tradition that trout and salmon are the only fish you eat. That applies to eels as well. W.S. Green, who was really the pioneer fishery scientist in Ireland, he suggested that until early in the 19th century, when the population exploded, the Irish had easy access to beef. And if you have easy access to beef, why would you go fishing?
The ESB began to try to restore the trout numbers, and in 1965 the Irish press reported them putting in as much as 40,000 young trout as part of a long-term restocking programme. But the pike and the perch and the roach seems to have been too much for the older immigrant trout. To end our story of the heyday of the trout, we return to the travel magazine of 1928 and a poem for the trout fisherman.
Trout, they jumped from the water, fell with a splash. I heard them laughing. This fellow is rash, to imagine a trout would swallow such trash. That's why I'd give a good deal to know what was wrong with the flies I cherished so and took so much trouble about.
A sentiment most fly fishermen would have felt some time on the rivers of their past.